The winter of 1944 was merciless. Across the forests of Belgium, where the Battle of the Bulge raged, the snow covered everything: fields, trucks, corpses, and broken promises. German soldiers huddled in frozen foxholes, watching the horizon for movement. When it came, it wasn't an army. It was a sound. The low hum of engines rolled through the trees like distant thunder. American supply trucks, hundreds of them, crawled up the narrow roads toward the front. To the German soldiers watching through binoculars, it seemed impossible. The trucks were still moving, fast, efficient, tireless, despite the cold that froze everything else solid. And then they saw it. The engines roared to life instantly. No cranking handles, no mechanics struggling in the cold. The American drivers simply pressed a button, and the machine started as if the weather didn't exist. The Germans stared in disbelief. "Electric starters," one officer muttered under his breath. "They start with electricity." It was more than a mechanical difference. It was a symbol. For German troops, it was proof of something they had begun to suspect but didn't want to admit. The Americans were fighting a different kind of war. A war powered by industry, not desperation. The Wehrmacht had marched on precision, discipline, and willpower. But America fought with abundance. Every truck, every rifle, every shell was a testament to factories running day and night across an ocean untouched by bombs. To a German infantryman, the American truck seemed almost alive. In contrast, German vehicles, often starved for parts and fuel, needed to be coaxed and cursed into motion. Soldiers pushed them, cranked them, begged them to move. Sometimes they didn't. By 1944, the German army's logistics system was collapsing. The once proud panzer divisions were running on fumes. Horses had returned to the front lines, millions of them, hauling artillery through the mud and snow like it was 1914 again. The Americans, meanwhile, drove. They drove in convoys so long that German pilots called them steel rivers. And when one truck broke down, another replaced it within hours. For the Germans who captured American vehicles, the difference was staggering. Inside, they found heaters, radios, reliable engines, and electric starters. Some even had cigarette lighters. To a man living on frozen rations, such details felt unreal, luxuries of a nation untouched by scarcity. Captured American trucks became prized trophies. German mechanics examined them like archaeologists uncovering alien technology. They couldn't believe how easy they were to maintain. Oil filters that could be changed in minutes. Spark plugs accessible without dismantling the engine. A system designed not for genius, but for simplicity. That simplicity was America's secret weapon. Where Germany built machines of brilliance, complex, efficient, but fragile, the United States built machines for war. Durable, repairable, replaceable. It was mass production as strategy, and it changed everything. One German corporal, captured after the war, would later say, "We thought we were better soldiers, but they were better prepared. Their trucks did not fear the cold, and neither did they. The electric starter was not just convenience, it was power, time, and reliability, the three things an army needs most when fighting a global war. And, for the Americans, it was only one piece of an industrial symphony. Because behind every truck that started with a button, there was a factory in Detroit, Chicago, or Cleveland working through the night. Thousands of hands, men and women alike, turning steel, shaping rubber, wiring circuits. The soldiers at the front didn't see them, but they were the true army, the invisible force that made victory possible. To the Germans in the Ardennes, that invisible force was now very visible. Every roar of an American truck reminded them that they weren't just fighting men. They were fighting machines built by a nation that refused to stop moving. And as the snow fell heavier that December, it became clear that the war wasn't just lost on the battlefield. It was lost in the factories, the assembly lines, and in the hum of an electric starter echoing through the frozen woods. As winter turned to mud, the American trucks kept rolling. They hauled everything: food, fuel, ammunition, even entire bridges. To the German troops who intercepted them, the scale was beyond comprehension. When captured, German soldiers would often ask the same question to their interrogators: "How do you build so many?" The answer was always the same: "We don't stop." By 1944, the United States had produced over 2 million military trucks, most of them equipped with electric starters. The Germans, in contrast, were struggling to maintain a fraction of that number. Even elite divisions received outdated or patched-up vehicles. Some were forced to use captured Soviet or French trucks, each with different parts, different fuels, and endless headaches for mechanics. But it wasn't just quantity. It was the philosophy behind the machines. American trucks were built for anyone to fix. A farm boy from Kansas could repair an engine in the dark, under fire, using a wrench and a spare part from another model. The Germans called it idiotensicher, idiot-proof. They said it with envy. In the chaos of war, efficiency is measured in minutes. A frozen starter crank could delay an entire convoy. A dead battery could leave ammunition stranded. For an army constantly on the move, electric starters saved lives as much as they saved time. Some German engineers dismissed it as luxury. "We don't need buttons to start our engines," one wrote in a 1943 field report. But those same engineers later admitted that freezing mornings in Russia had destroyed more vehicles than enemy fire. The electric starter was not an accident. It was foresight. Decades earlier, American engineers had embraced practicality over perfection. They designed systems for the ordinary, not the exceptional. And that mindset built an army of machines that outlasted, outnumbered, and outperformed the best Europe could build. Captured U.S. trucks often became the backbone of German logistics late in the war. The Wehrmacht marked them with crosses, repainted them gray, and used them wherever fuel allowed. Many German officers privately admitted that without these captured vehicles, some units would have collapsed completely. One lieutenant wrote in his journal, "The Americans fight with a comfort we cannot imagine. Even their engines are civilized." The difference wasn't just technical, it was cultural. German engineering prized complexity. American engineering prized reliability. One sought perfection. The other sought function. And in war, function wins. In the fields of France, in the mountains of Italy, and across the forests of Belgium, American trucks proved unstoppable. They carried the war forward, supplies in, wounded out, hope restored mile by mile. Even the enemy began to respect them, not because they were beautiful or advanced, but because they never quit. When the war ended and Germany lay in ruins, some of those captured trucks were still running. Decades later, farmers found them abandoned in barns and fields. A bit of fuel, a charged battery, and the engine would turn again, just like it did in the snow of 1944. They were relics, not of destruction, but of endurance, the quiet hum of progress that outlasted empires. And for the German soldiers who had once laughed at the simplicity of an electric starter, the sound of that small motor turning over would remain one of the war's most haunting memories. A reminder that sometimes victory comes not from brilliance, but from the power to keep moving when everything else is frozen. For the Germans, the sight of those American convoys became something more than mechanical envy. It became psychological defeat. They had entered the war believing they were the world's masters of engineering. Their tanks, their planes, their artillery, all crafted with the precision of a watchmaker. But now, in the final years, they were facing something they couldn't outthink or outbuild, a machine built for everyone. The American truck didn't need a genius to operate. It didn't require ritual or finesse. It simply worked. In German units, Every engine had personality. Each truck started differently. Each weapon had its quirks. Mechanics treated their vehicles like living things, coaxing them to life in the morning frost. But the Americans? They pressed a button and moved. Captured German officers couldn't believe the scale of it. American logistics seemed limitless. Entire columns of vehicles stretched for miles, moving supplies, fuel, food, and men. Each one could start instantly, even in temperatures that froze oil and stiffened steel. For soldiers who had fought through the Russian winter, the difference was staggering. They remembered their own vehicles refusing to start at 30 degrees Celsius. Men pushing trucks through snowdrifts while artillery thundered nearby, batteries dying before dawn, frozen fingers clinging to crank handles that snapped like glass. Now, watching American convoys move effortlessly, they understood what true industrial power meant. It wasn't just the starter, it was everything around it. Heated cabins, reliable tires, spare parts, radios. Even the fuel itself, refined and uniform, unlike the mix of substitutes that Germany had resorted to. Each truck symbolized a system that worked, a chain of production, supply, and replacement so vast it seemed infinite. And for the Germans, that realization hurt more than defeat. It meant their war, their sacrifices, their ingenuity. All were being crushed by something simple and relentless. In the final months, stories spread through German ranks of captured American vehicles that still ran after being riddled with bullets. Trucks with engines purring after tank shells had missed them by inches. Soldiers joked bitterly that even American machinery refused to die. One sergeant from the 2nd Panzer Division wrote in his diary, "Their trucks are not weapons, but they might as well be. They keep the war alive for them." He wasn't wrong. Behind every American advance, from Normandy to Bastogne to the Rhine, stood those trucks. They carried gasoline, ammunition, and food to front lines faster than any army had ever moved. When tanks ran dry, trucks filled them. When soldiers starved, trucks fed them. The electric starter was a small innovation, but it represented something bigger. America's refusal to let nature, fatigue, or failure stop its advance. The German army, brilliant in design but trapped by scarcity, could not keep up. Their machines required perfection to work. The Americans built for imperfection, and that's why they won. And as the snow melted in early 1945, the last remnants of the Wehrmacht began to understand that they weren't just losing the war on the ground. They had lost it long before, in the factories, on the assembly lines, in the quiet hum of an engine that always started when you needed it most. In the spring of 1945, the war was collapsing. Bridges burned, roads crumbled, and the German army moved on foot more than by engine. Horses pulled cannons through ruins while American trucks crossed rivers on floating pontoons, engines roaring without hesitation. To those watching, it seemed as though America had mechanized the impossible. For every destroyed vehicle, another replaced it within hours. Engineers repaired engines in the field. Soldiers replaced tires in the rain. Convoys reorganized without pause. The system worked because it was built for chaos. Electric starters became a metaphor among American troops, a symbol of what separated them from the enemy. They joked that our trucks start faster than their generals think. And it wasn't just bravado. The mechanical reliability of those vehicles meant something deeper. It gave men confidence. It meant that when orders came, movement followed. No delay, no cold fingers on metal cranks. Just ignition, motion, progress. For the Germans, the experience was humiliating. They saw prisoners being transported in American trucks that looked more comfortable than their own command vehicles. They saw American mechanics repairing engines with tools that came in organized kits, each labeled, each replaceable. Meanwhile, German workshops were running out of everything. Wrenches were forged from scrap. Lubricants were improvised. Batteries were dead. Cables stripped from civilian cars. The electric starter was a reminder of how far behind they had fallen, not in courage, but in preparation. Even high-ranking officers noticed it. In a post-war interview, General Heinz Guderian, the architect of the Blitzkrieg, admitted that America's greatest weapon was not its tanks or planes, but its logistics. They could move mountains, he said. And they did. He might as well have been talking about the trucks. The Germans had built masterpieces like the Tiger and the Panther, machines of power and elegance. But they were fragile, complex, expensive. They broke more often than they fought. The Americans built the opposite, tools, not trophies, trucks that didn't win glory, but won wars. When German soldiers captured one, they often refused to give it back. Even after surrender, some kept them for months, using them to rebuild, to carry supplies, to survive. There are photographs of them, men in faded uniforms, standing proudly beside trucks they once called the enemies. It was a quiet acknowledgement of respect, and yet, for many, it was also a haunting reminder of what had been lost. Not just the war, but a belief in German superiority, in their technological destiny. The button that started an American engine had also shut down an empire. By the time the guns fell silent in May, those trucks were still moving, delivering bread to civilians, transporting the wounded, helping rebuild the land they had helped destroy. The war that began with noise ended with an engine's hum. Not the roar of victory, but the steady rhythm of a machine that refused to stop. By the time Germany began to crumble, even the smallest American inventions had become symbols of an unstoppable tide. The electric starter was no longer just a technical advantage, it was a metaphor for motion itself. Every time a German soldier heard that soft hum of ignition, it reminded him of something his own army had lost: momentum. For years, German propaganda had glorified strength through discipline, the superiority of will over weakness. But no amount of will could compete with a machine that never failed to start. In the cold mud of collapsing Europe, soldiers whispered about the endless convoys, the Red Ball Express, they called it, a rolling artery of trucks that fed the front with everything it needed. From ammunition to chocolate, it kept the war machine alive. The Germans listened to those stories with disbelief. Trucks that ran day and night, roads filled with headlights stretching to the horizon. It sounded impossible, but it wasn't. The United States had mastered something Germany never truly did: logistics at scale, the ability to move supplies faster than the enemy could destroy them. And it all started with a simple turn of a key. To the exhausted men in gray, this was sorcery. Their own vehicles, if they had any fuel left, were unpredictable. Cranking them to life was an ordeal, half ritual, half prayer. Frozen oil, broken gears, dead batteries. The cold devoured everything mechanical. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to defy nature. Their engines roared in snow, mud, and rain alike. Their trucks started even in the middle of artillery fire. Captured mechanics took apart electric starters to understand how they worked. They marveled at the simplicity: a motor, a solenoid, a small current sparking life into a massive engine. They used ingenuity where we used complexity, one German engineer later wrote. That simplicity became terrifying. In war, simplicity is survival. It means fewer delays, fewer mistakes, fewer excuses. The Americans had built an army of machines that didn't need miracles to function, just electricity and fuel. Even the Luftwaffe noticed it. Recon pilots reported that American supply routes never truly stopped. They move like blood through veins, one officer said. Cut them in one place, and they flow somewhere else. And that flow, that endless pulse of movement, was the sound of defeat for Germany. In villages, German civilians watched as endless American convoys passed through, engines humming, soldiers laughing, radios playing music. The contrast was unbearable. One nation was still living in the future while the other was collapsing into the past. And so, in a strange way, the electric starter became a symbol of the modern world. A quiet click that said, "The machine obeys me." For the Germans who had spent years fighting mud, ice, and fire, that sound was unbearable and unforgettable. After the war, many German soldiers spoke of those trucks with a strange mix of awe and bitterness. They didn't talk about tanks or planes. They talked about engines that started in one touch, about convoys that moved without pause, about how, in the final months, the sound of those engines replaced the sound of their own artillery. To them, it became a reminder of how thoroughly they had been outmatched, not by courage or strategy, but by engineering philosophy. Germany had built masterpieces. America had built tools, and in war, tools win. In Allied-occupied zones, American trucks continued to roam the roads, delivering food, fuel, medicine. To civilians, they became symbols of survival. To former soldiers, symbols of humiliation. Many of those trucks were repurposed, painted over, used to rebuild the same towns they had once helped destroy. Their engines still started with the same soft hum, steady, obedient, eternal. For the Americans, it was business as usual. The same industries that had produced weapons of war now turned to peace. Ford, Dodge, and GMC returned to making cars for families. The same electric starter that powered victory would now power prosperity. For the Germans, the electric starter became a story told in barracks and bars for years afterward. A small thing that said everything about the enemy's power. It was like magic, one veteran recalled in 1960. "We turned our handles until our arms bled. They just pressed a button." That button haunted them. It was the sound of a future they never reached. Historians later called it the mechanical gap, the difference between a nation fighting to survive and one fighting with limitless energy. The electric starter was only one piece of it, but it symbolized the whole: power, precision, and scale. When you pressed that button, an entire civilization answered. Factories, engineers, assembly lines, workers, all synchronized in one effortless motion. The Germans had fought for ideology. The Americans had fought with infrastructure, and in that difference lay the outcome of the war. Decades later, in museums across Europe, visitors still stare at those old trucks, rusted, preserved, immortal. Some stand behind glass, others rest in fields reclaimed by grass. But when a restorer connects a new battery, the result is always the same. A hum, a spark, a heartbeat of history. The same sound that once echoed through the forests of Belgium and made an army stop and listen. It's not just a story about trucks. It's a story about progress, how one nation turned technology into destiny, and how, for a few German soldiers in the frozen woods, the future arrived with a single click. In post-war Germany, American vehicles became a familiar sight. They filled the roads that once echoed with tank tracks and marching boots. But for those who had fought against them, the sight was never casual. To the ordinary German veteran, seeing an American truck rolling effortlessly through the countryside was like seeing the war replayed in miniature. Only this time, in silence. The same design that had carried armies now carried bread, medicine, lumber. The same engines that once fed destruction were rebuilding what had been lost. And that irony was impossible to ignore. In small towns, children gathered when they heard the distant hum of engines. They watched the olive-drab trucks approach, heavy with supplies from the Marshall Plan. Inside those vehicles was food wrapped in paper, stamped USA. To hungry eyes, it looked like salvation. The same machine that had symbolized defeat had now become a symbol of survival. For the American soldiers who stayed behind, it was just duty. They didn't think of it as poetic or ironic. They were simply moving cargo, keeping the world in motion. But to the Germans, that motion was hypnotic. The trucks never stopped. Not during war, not during peace. They represented a rhythm of life that seemed eternal. One German mechanic, who later joined a reconstruction project, was given the job of maintaining a captured GMC truck. He couldn't believe how it still worked after years of service. "It starts," he wrote in his notebook, "as if it never knew the word war." That reliability became a quiet teacher. In factories rebuilt from ruins, German engineers began to study the simplicity of American design. They learned not from textbooks, but from metal. They learned that greatness in engineering wasn't about perfection. It was about endurance. And from that lesson, an entire new Germany would rise. The trucks, in their own strange way, became blueprints for a new philosophy. Build not for glory, but for longevity. In the late 1940s, when Volkswagen began producing civilian vehicles again, many of its engineers admitted privately that they drew inspiration from what they had seen in American machinery. Modularity, serviceability, efficiency. The same men who once cursed American innovation were now quietly copying it. The irony deepened further when US-made electric starters began appearing in post-war German vehicles. What was once a weapon of the enemy had become part of everyday life. Taxi drivers, farmers, and delivery men now started their engines with the same effortless click that had once symbolized defeat. Progress, it seemed, was contagious. For a generation of Germans, the electric starter was no longer a reminder of humiliation. It was a sign that the future had arrived. And this time, it included them. Decades later, when historians interviewed veterans of both sides, the story of the trucks always resurfaced. Not because it was glorious, but because it was revealing. The war had shown that victory belonged not just to armies or ideologies, but to systems, to the nations that could build faster, simpler, and smarter, and nothing embodied that better than an electric starter. To the Germans, it was a moment frozen in time, standing in the cold, watching a foreign machine come alive with a hum while theirs refused to move. That moment said everything about the century that followed. America had mastered the future. Germany had been consumed by its own past. The sound of that starter became the sound of inevitability, the quiet click that turned an empire into a memory. But time has a strange sense of humor. In the decades that followed, German and American engineers would work side by side. Their descendants would design together, build together, trade ideas freely. The nations that once faced each other across frozen battlefields would one day build cars that started with the same effortless motion. No cranks, no smoke, just progress. The war ended, but the lessons remained. The story of the American trucks became a parable told in classrooms and documentaries. It wasn't just about machines, it was about the philosophy behind them. That simplicity beats sophistication when the world is burning. That adaptability outlives perfection. That resilience, not brilliance, wins wars and peace. Every military historian who studies logistics eventually returns to those trucks. The Red Ball Express, the endless convoys, the humming engines that refused to stop. They were the arteries of an empire built not on conquest, but on supply. And the German soldiers who witnessed it never forgot. Many of them would later say that the war ended for them not when they surrendered, but when they saw that first American truck start without a crank. That sound was the future being born. Today, in museums across Europe and America, some of those trucks still exist. Their metal is rusted, their tires cracked, but when enthusiasts restore them, when the battery connects and the button is pressed, the engine still turns over. The sound is the same as it was in 1944. A hum, a spark, the voice of a machine that changed history. And somewhere, in that sound, is the echo of every soldier who watched it for the first time and understood that the war had already been lost before the first shot of that starter ever fired. By the 1950s, the echo of those engines had faded from the forests of Europe, but their impact lingered everywhere. The war was over, but its machines remained. They sat in barns, in depots, in forgotten fields, relics of a time when motion itself was a weapon. Some were repainted for civilian use. Others were sold to farmers who used them for decades after peace returned, and in every one of those machines, a small electric starter waited, patient as ever, ready to bring life back with a single spark. It was remarkable how something so small could symbolize an entire philosophy. To push a button and command motion, that was modernity. For the post-war world, it was more than convenience. It was faith in progress. The electric starter became a quiet metaphor for everything the new generation believed in: simplicity, reliability, control. The Germans, rebuilding from ruin, took that lesson deeply to heart. The same country that once built complex war machines now became a global leader in precision engineering. But beneath the sophistication of post-war German cars and machinery lay the same principle they had once underestimated: effortless functionality. In that sense, the war had been the greatest classroom of the century. In the East, Soviet engineers studied captured American trucks too. They copied their design and applied it to their own vehicles, spreading the same concept across continents. The hum of an electric starter could now be heard from Berlin to Vladivostok. And though most never thought of it, that tiny mechanism had quietly united enemies through imitation. In the archives, historians found German field reports describing the enemy's mechanical superiority. They spoke of electric ignition systems as though describing sorcery. Some of those documents were later studied by engineers in West Germany, who laughed at the irony. Their predecessors had feared the very thing that would later define their industry. 33. Americans had unknowingly taught their rivals a final lesson: the importance of practicality over pride. One American veteran, interviewed in 1975, said it best: "We didn't win because we were smarter. We won because our stuff worked." His words summarized a truth the entire world had learned the hard way. The future belonged not to those who built the most perfect machines, but to those who built the ones that never stopped. Even in peacetime, that philosophy became universal. Electric starters were now in tractors, trucks, cars, ships, even generators that powered homes. The hum that once startled German soldiers in the snow had become the heartbeat of civilization itself. And though few remembered where it began, the story of those shocked soldiers lived on in the background of every ignition key ever turned. Time, as it always does, turned memory into history. The forests where soldiers once froze are now quiet highways. The trucks that once carried ammunition now sit behind museum glass. But if you stand close enough, you can still smell the oil, the rubber, the metal, the scent of a world that learned how to move. Visitors often walk past those exhibits without realizing what they're seeing. To them, it's just an old truck. But to anyone who understands history, it's something much greater. It's the machine that taught the 20th century how to function. The American truck wasn't just a vehicle, it was an idea. It said that technology should serve humans, not intimidate them. That strength was measured not by complexity, but by endurance. Every bolt, every wire, every gear represented the victory of practicality over arrogance. The Germans, who had once prided themselves on mechanical mastery, eventually came to embrace that same philosophy. By the 1960s, their factories built cars that started as smoothly as the American trucks they once feared. The teacher had become the student, and then the equal. And yet, in interviews decades later, old veterans would still shake their heads in disbelief. They could still remember that first time. The snow, the silence, the click. the impossible hum. For them, that moment never faded. It was the instant they realized they were fighting against the future. It wasn't the sound of defeat. It was the sound of inevitability. Even now, in documentaries and oral histories, that scene plays like a parable. Soldiers staring in disbelief at engines that came alive without struggle. Machines moving when everything else had stopped. In that single sound was everything the modern world would become. Automation, confidence, speed. The story of those soldiers and those trucks isn't about humiliation. It's about revelation. It's about what happens when technology changes faster than belief, when progress outpaces ideology, and in the end, it's a story about humanity's relationship with the machine. The electric starter was just a spark, but that spark lit a path that would carry us into an age of motion. Cars, planes, rockets, satellites. From muddy roads to the stars, the same principle remained. Press a button, and the world moves. For the men who watched in 1944, that was unimaginable. For us, it's everyday life. The sound of that button still echoes through history. A hum, soft but eternal. The hum of a machine that didn't just start an engine, it started a new world.